Welcome to Sleepy Night History. Tonight, we travel slowly back through time. Outside, the rain falls softly. The night is quiet. And far away in the distant past, a story begins. It begins more than 2,000 years ago in the ancient lands of Eastern Asia. In those distant centuries, the land we now call China was not yet a single empire. Instead, it was divided into many kingdoms. Each kingdom ruled its own territory. Each king commanded his own armies. And each court was filled with advisors, generals, scholars, and diplomats. Historians later gave this era a name. They called it the Warring States period. For generations, powerful states struggled for influence across the broad river valleys and plains of ancient China. The land itself was beautiful and vast. Great rivers flowed across fertile plains. Among the most important were the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. These rivers nourished the farms that sustained the people. Farmers worked rice fields and wheat fields beneath wide open skies. Villages stood beside quiet streams. Markets filled with merchants selling silk, pottery, grain, and tea. But beyond the peaceful countryside, the rulers of the states watched each other carefully. 7 great kingdoms dominated the political landscape. These were Qin, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, and Qi. Each kingdom dreamed of becoming the strongest. Each ruler hoped to bring the others under his control. Among these states, one lay far to the west. It was a rugged land surrounded by mountains and rivers. Its people were known for their discipline and strong military traditions. This was the state of Qin. For many years, Qin had been considered distant from the cultural centers of the eastern states. Yet its rulers had slowly transformed the kingdom into a powerful and organized society. Qin adopted strict laws. Its leaders believed that order and discipline were the foundations of strength. Officials were chosen for their ability rather than their family names. Farmers and soldiers were rewarded for loyalty and service. Over time, these policies made Qin one of the most efficient states in the region. Its armies became large and well organized. Its government became highly centralized. And its rulers began thinking not merely about defending their territory, but about unifying all the lands under one authority. It was into this ambitious and disciplined kingdom that a child would soon be born. The child's birth took place in the year 259 before Christ. He was born far from the capital of Qin, in the state of Zhao. At the time, his father was living there as a political hostage. The boy's name was Ying Zhang. History would later remember him by a far more famous title. But in those early days, he was simply a royal child growing up in uncertain circumstances. His father, King Zhuangxiang of Qin, had once been a prince of Qin. But during the complicated diplomacy of the Warring States era, princes were sometimes sent to rival courts as hostages to ensure peace agreements. Living in Zhao was therefore not entirely safe for the young family. Political alliances could shift quickly. War could break out without warning. The boy's childhood began during a time of uncertainty and danger. Yet destiny often begins quietly. The infant Ying Zhang could not yet know that he would one day change the history of an entire civilization. For now, he lived within the household of his parents, cared for by attendants and protected by loyal supporters. Beyond the walls of the residence, the world of the warring states continued its restless motion. Armies marched along dusty roads. Messengers carried news between distant courts. Kings and ministers debated strategy in palace halls. Each kingdom watched the others carefully. Each ruler wondered which state might eventually dominate the land. Years passed slowly. The child grew into a quiet and observant boy. His early life was shaped by the political struggles surrounding his family. Eventually, events in the kingdom of Qin would change everything. His father would return to Qin and become king. And the young boy, still only a child, would soon find himself standing at the center of one of the most remarkable stories in ancient history. For the future emperor of China had been born, and the long journey toward the unification of the warring states was only just beginning. The night continues quietly. Rain falls softly beyond the window, and our journey through the distant past moves forward. Slowly, one moment at a time. In the previous part of our story, we arrived at the birth of a child named Ying Zhang. That child would one day be known as Qin Shi Huang. But at the time of his birth, no one could yet imagine the path that lay ahead of him. He had been born during the long and difficult era historians call the Warring States period. 7 powerful kingdoms competed for influence across the ancient lands of China. Among them, the state of Qin had slowly grown stronger with each passing generation. Yet the story of Ying Zhang's early life did not begin inside the capital of Qin. It began in a distant and uncertain place. At the time of his birth, his father was living in the rival state of Zhao. The city where the family stayed was called Handan. Handan was a large and active city. Its streets were filled with traders, soldiers, scholars, and craftsmen. Markets opened each morning as merchants arranged their goods beneath colorful banners. Farmers arrived from the countryside carrying grain and vegetables. Travelers from distant states brought news of political changes and military campaigns. Yet for the young prince's family, life in Handan was not entirely peaceful. His father, King Xiang of Qin, had originally been a prince of Qin. But during complicated negotiations between rival states, he had been sent to Zhao as a hostage. This practice was not unusual in the politics of the time. When 2 kingdoms wished to guarantee peace between them, they sometimes exchanged members of their royal families. These princes lived at the rival court as a kind of living promise that agreements would be honored. While living as a hostage, the Prince of Qin experienced a life filled with uncertainty. He lived comfortably enough within the court of Zhao, but he was also watched carefully. If war broke out between the 2 states, his safety might no longer be guaranteed. It was during these uncertain years that the future emperor was born. His mother was a woman known to history as Lady Zhao. Ancient writers sometimes described her life as complicated and mysterious. The politics surrounding the Qin prince had already drawn the attention of an ambitious merchant and political strategist named Lu Buwei. Lu Buwei was not a nobleman by birth. He had begun his career as a merchant, traveling across the kingdoms of China conducting business. But he possessed a sharp mind and an extraordinary ability to understand political opportunities.
When he encountered the exiled prince of Qin in Handan, Lu Buwei saw something others had overlooked. He believed that this prince might one day return to Qin and rise to power. If that happened, anyone who had supported him might gain great influence. Lu Buwei therefore decided to invest his resources in helping the prince. He provided financial support. He helped the prince build relationships within the courts of various states. And slowly, through diplomacy and careful negotiation, he arranged for the prince to return to Qin. When the prince finally returned to his homeland, events began moving quickly. Not long afterward, he became king, and the young boy Ying Jiang suddenly found himself the son of the ruler of Qin. The journey from Handan to Qin must have been long and filled with unfamiliar sights. Travel across ancient China required patience. Caravans moved slowly along dusty roads. Mountains rose along the horizon. Rivers crossed the land like long silver ribbons. Villages appeared among fields of grain. As the young prince arrived in Qin, he entered a kingdom very different from the eastern states. The capital of Qin at the time was the city of Xianyang. Xianyang stood near the waters of the Wei River. The city had been designed to reflect the disciplined character of the Qin state. Wide roads connected government buildings and military barracks. Administrative offices were filled with officials carefully recording taxes, laws, and military orders. Unlike many other kingdoms where noble families held great power, Qin had gradually developed a system where authority flowed directly from the ruler through appointed officials. This structure made the kingdom unusually efficient. It also made it extremely powerful. When Ying Jiang arrived in the capital as a child, he entered a court already filled with ambitious figures. Among them stood Lu Buwei, who had helped bring the prince back from Zhao. Lu Buwei quickly became one of the most influential advisors in the kingdom. But the life of the young prince soon changed dramatically.
In the year 247 before Christ, King Zhuangxiang died. The throne of Qin suddenly passed to his son. Ying Jiang was only 13 years old. In ancient kingdoms, it was not unusual for young rulers to inherit the throne. But a child could not govern alone. During the early years of Ying Jiang's reign, real authority rested in the hands of powerful advisors. Lu Buwei became the chief regent. From the great halls of the Qin palace, he supervised the administration of the state. Ministers issued orders in the name of the young king. Armies continued preparing for campaigns. Engineers constructed roads and defensive walls. Meanwhile, the young ruler watched and learned. Palace life during these years followed a careful routine. Each day, officials arrived to present reports. Messengers carried news from distant provinces. Scholars discussed matters of philosophy and law. The political philosophy guiding Qin's government was known as legalism. Legalist thinkers believed that strong laws and strict enforcement were necessary to maintain order. Rewards encouraged loyalty. Punishments discouraged disobedience. In Qin, these ideas had already shaped society for many years. The young king grew up surrounded by this disciplined system. Although he was still a teenager, he observed carefully how power moved through the state. He listened to advisors. He studied the reports of generals. He learned how the government managed agriculture, taxation, and military organization. Beyond the palace walls, the wider world of the warring states continued its endless competition. The states of Zhao, Wei, Chu, Han, Yan, and Qi still stood strong. Each kingdom watched the others with suspicion. Each ruler hoped to avoid defeat while searching for opportunities to expand. Yet among these rival states, Qin possessed several important advantages. Its government was highly organized. Its armies were disciplined. Its leaders were willing to adopt bold strategies. These strengths would soon begin changing the balance of power across the entire region. But the young king still had one more challenge to overcome before he could truly control his kingdom. Because within the palace itself, hidden struggles for influence were quietly unfolding. Advisors competed for power. Alliances formed and dissolved. And the young ruler would soon discover that ruling a kingdom required more than simply wearing a crown. He would need patience. He would need intelligence. And above all, he would need the ability to seize control of his own destiny. For the boy who had become king at 13 was slowly growing into a man. And when he finally took full command of Qin, the long era of the warring states would begin moving toward its final chapter. But that moment still lies ahead in our journey. For now, the young king Ying Zheng continues watching, learning, and preparing. And the quiet kingdom of Qin stands waiting in the western lands, ready for the rise of the ruler who would one day unite all of China. The young king continued to grow within the quiet but powerful court of the state of Qin. Although he wore the crown, real authority still rested with the ministers who governed in his name. Among them, the most influential remained the regent Lu Buwei. Lu Buwei had helped the young king's father return from exile years earlier. Because of that service, he held enormous influence within the Qin court. Officials listened carefully when he spoke. Generals respected his authority, and many decisions of the state passed through his hands. Yet the young king watched all of this with quiet attention. From childhood, Ying Zheng had lived among shifting alliances and uncertain politics. He had learned that power in royal courts could change very quickly. So during these early years of his reign, he observed more than he acted. Every morning, the palace of Xianyang came slowly to life. Servants swept the stone courtyards. Officials arrived carrying bundles of bamboo scrolls tied together with cord. Messengers from distant provinces waited patiently outside the administrative halls. These scrolls contained reports about crops, taxes, population counts, and military preparations. The Kingdom of Qin had developed one of the most organized governments in the warring states world. Clerks carefully recorded information from every district. Farmers were registered. Land was measured. Soldiers were counted. The state kept detailed records so that it could manage its resources efficiently. This system had been shaped by the philosophy known as legalism. Legalist scholars believed that strong laws and disciplined administration were the foundation of a powerful state. According to their ideas, loyalty to the ruler must be rewarded. Disobedience must be punished. Officials were expected to serve the state faithfully, regardless of family background or noble lineage. This philosophy suited the ambitions of the Qin rulers. Over many decades, it had transformed their kingdom into a disciplined and efficient society. The young king grew up surrounded by these ideas. He studied the reports presented to the court. He listened to debates between ministers. He observed the way authority flowed from the throne through the layers of government. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom of Qin continued preparing for the struggles that defined the warring states era. Armies trained in the fields beyond the capital. Blacksmiths forged weapons from iron and bronze. Engineers strengthened defensive walls and constructed roads that allowed troops to move quickly across the countryside. The land surrounding Qin was rugged. Mountains rose along its western borders. Rivers cut through deep valleys. These natural barriers helped protect the kingdom, but they also meant that Qin had learned to rely on strong organization and discipline. In the eastern states, rival kingdoms continued watching Qin carefully. Among them were the powerful states of Zhao, Chu, Wei, Han, Yan, and Qi. Each possessed its own armies, traditions, and ambitions. Each ruler dreamed of becoming the dominant power in the region. For the moment, however, Qin's young king remained under the shadow of his regent. Lu Buwei guided the affairs of the kingdom while the king continued maturing. But within the palace, new tensions were quietly developing. Court politics often involved rival factions competing for influence. One of the figures who gained attention during these years was a man known as Lao Ai. Ancient accounts describe Lao Ai as someone who rose to influence within the palace through connections with members of the royal household. Over time, he gathered supporters and began building his own circle of allies. These developments were dangerous. In royal courts, anyone who gathered too much influence risked threatening the authority of the throne itself. The young king gradually became aware of the situation. By now, he was no longer a child. He was approaching adulthood. Years of observation had sharpened his understanding of power. And when he finally chose to act, he did so with sudden determination. In the year 238 before Christ, a dramatic confrontation unfolded. Lao Ai attempted to lead a rebellion within the capital. Supporters tried to seize control of important palace buildings, but the attempt failed. Royal guards and loyal officials quickly suppressed the uprising. The rebellion ended swiftly. Lao Ai was captured and punished according to the strict laws of Qin. For the young king, the event marked a turning point. The rebellion revealed the dangers of allowing powerful figures to control the court. Afterward, Ying Zheng moved decisively to strengthen his personal authority. The influence of Lu Buwei also began to decline. Although Lu Buwei had once served as the kingdom's most powerful minister, The young king now wished to rule independently. Over time, Lu Bu was removed from his position. His long career at the center of Qin politics quietly came to an end. With these changes, the young ruler finally assumed full control of his kingdom. Ying Zheng was now the true king of Qin. He had reached adulthood. He had survived the intrigues of palace politics, and he had learned the difficult lessons of power. Beyond the palace, the wider world of the warring states remained divided. 6 rival kingdoms still stood across the eastern lands, but the balance between them was slowly changing. The kingdom of Qin had grown stronger with each passing generation. Its armies were disciplined. Its administration was efficient. Its leaders were determined. Now, under the authority of a young and ambitious king, Qin would begin the long series of campaigns that would transform the map of China. The wars that followed would not happen all at once. They would unfold gradually over many years. Generals would lead armies across mountains and rivers. Cities would fall one by one. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries would slowly disappear. And through those campaigns, the young king Ying Zheng would begin the extraordinary journey that would eventually make him the first emperor of a united China. But that great transformation still lies ahead. For now, the young king stands in the halls of his palace in Xianyang. The rebellions within the court have ended. His authority is secure, and beyond the mountains of Qin, the rival states continue watching. They do not yet know that the quiet ruler of the Western Kingdom is preparing to change the fate of the entire land. The era of the warring states is slowly approaching its final chapter, and the young king of Qin is ready to begin the long path toward unification. The young king of Qin now stood firmly in control of his kingdom. The palace intrigues that had once surrounded his early years had quieted. The rebellion within the court had been suppressed. The powerful regent, Lu Bu had faded from influence. For the first time since ascending the throne as a child, the king ruled with full authority. He was still known simply as Ying Zheng, but the ambitions growing within his mind were already far greater than the borders of his own kingdom. Beyond the mountains and rivers that protected Qin, the other great states of the Warring States period still stood across the eastern plains. These rival kingdoms had fought each other for generations. Each state had its own traditions. Each king maintained his own armies and advisors, and each believed that survival depended on vigilance and strength. To the east lay the states of Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi. Their territories stretched across fertile river valleys and ancient cities. Some were wealthy, some were powerful, but all of them watched the rise of Qin with growing concern. The kingdom of Qin had been transforming itself for decades. Long before Ying Zheng became king, earlier rulers had adopted reforms that made the state unusually disciplined and efficient. The philosophy guiding these reforms was known as legalism. Legalist thinkers believed that a strong state required clear laws, strict administration, and a powerful ruler. They argued that loyalty should be rewarded and disobedience punished. Officials were appointed according to ability rather than noble birth. Farmers and soldiers were expected to contribute directly to the strength of the state. These ideas had shaped Qin into a remarkably organized society. Fields were carefully measured. Taxes were collected systematically. Military training was strict and disciplined, and the roads connecting cities allowed armies to move quickly across the land. When Ying Zheng assumed full authority, he inherited this powerful system. But he also inherited a bold vision. He believed that the endless wars between the states must eventually end. And in his mind, there was only one way to bring lasting peace. The land must be united under a single ruler. The young king did not rush forward recklessly. Instead, he gathered capable advisors who shared his vision. Among them was an extraordinary strategist named Li Si. Li Si was a scholar deeply influenced by legalist philosophy. He believed strongly in the power of centralized authority. In his writings and advice to the king, he argued that the divided states weakened the land. Only a unified empire could bring stability and order. Li Si's ideas resonated with Ying Zheng. Together, the king and his advisors began planning a long and careful strategy. They understood that conquering the rival states would require patience. Each kingdom possessed armies and fortified cities. A single campaign would not be enough. Instead, Qin would gradually defeat its enemies one by one. Generals were appointed. Armies were trained. Supplies were prepared. Across the countryside of Qin, blacksmiths forged swords and spearheads. Workers strengthened city walls and repaired roads. Messengers carried instructions between military commanders and government officials. Meanwhile, life within the kingdom continued its steady rhythm. Farmers planted crops along the fertile valleys near the Wei River. Villages gathered during seasonal festivals. Markets in the capital of Xianyang filled with merchants selling silk, pottery, grains, and tea. Yet beneath the calm appearance of daily life, the kingdom was preparing for transformation. The first target of Qin's expansion was the nearby state of Han. Han was smaller than many of the other kingdoms. It had struggled to defend itself against stronger neighbors for many years. Qin's generals recognized this weakness. In the year 230 before Christ, Qin armies marched eastward. Soldiers moved along the roads in organized columns. Their armor glinted beneath the sun. Banners bearing the symbols of Qin fluttered in the wind. The campaign against Han moved quickly. Its defenses could not withstand the disciplined forces of Qin. Within a short time, Han surrendered. The first of the 7 states had fallen. The conquest sent ripples of concern through the remaining kingdoms. For generations, the states had fought each other in shifting alliances. But now, something different was happening. One kingdom was rising above the others. Yet Ying Zheng did not stop. His strategy continued moving forward. The next target was the state of Zhao. Zhao had once been one of Qin's strongest rivals. Its soldiers were skilled fighters, especially in cavalry warfare. But years of previous battles had weakened Zhao's strength. Qin generals advanced carefully across the frontier. Battles unfolded across the plains and hills separating the two states. After a long struggle, Zhao's capital eventually fell. Another kingdom disappeared from the map of the warring states. The pattern continued. The state of Wei was conquered next, then Yan. Each campaign required planning and patience. Sometimes Qin used diplomacy, sometimes deception, sometimes overwhelming military force. Years passed as the borders of Qin expanded steadily eastward. Among the remaining states, the powerful kingdom of Chu still stood as a formidable opponent. Chu controlled vast territories and large armies. Its culture was ancient and proud. Defeating Chu would require one of the most difficult campaigns of the entire unification. But that challenge still lay ahead. For now, the young king of Qin watched as his vision slowly began taking shape. The map of the warring states was changing. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries were disappearing. And with each victory, Ying Zheng moved closer to the goal that had once seemed impossible. A single, unified land. One empire. One ruler. But the journey toward that moment was far from complete. Several powerful states still remained, and the most difficult battles were still to come. For the young king standing in the halls of Xianyang was preparing for the final campaigns that would reshape the history of China forever. The winds of the warring states era were beginning to settle, and the rise of the first emperor was drawing ever closer.
The victories of the kingdom of Qin continue to reshape the landscape of ancient China. With each passing year, the number of rival states grew smaller. The old balance that had once defined the warring states era was slowly fading. Yet the path toward unification was not simple. Several powerful kingdoms still remained. Among them, the most formidable was the great southern state of Chu. The land of Chu was vast. Its territory stretched across fertile plains and deep forests. Rivers flowed through its countryside, feeding fields of rice and millet. Its culture was ancient and proud. For generations, Chu had been one of the strongest kingdoms in the land. Many people believed it would be impossible for Qin to conquer such a powerful state. But the young king, Ying Zheng, believed otherwise. Within the halls of the capital city of Xianyang, the king met often with his generals and ministers. Among the most trusted advisors at his side remained the strategist Li Si. Together they studied maps spread across large wooden tables. They examined reports sent from the frontiers. Messengers traveled constantly between military commanders and the royal court. The conquest of Chu would require careful preparation. Its armies were large. Its territories were vast. Many believed that defeating Chu might require the full strength of the Qin military. At first, some generals underestimated the challenge. One commander proposed attacking with a relatively small force, but another experienced general, Wang Jian, advised caution. Wang Jian had served Qin for many years. He understood the strength of Chu. He recommended assembling a much larger army. The young king listened carefully. After considering both opinions, he chose to follow the cautious strategy. Wang Jian was given command of a vast force. Soldiers gathered from across the kingdom. Armies marched along the wide roads that connected Qin's growing territories. Supply wagons carried grain and weapons. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly to produce armor and blades. The campaign against Chu became one of the largest military operations of the entire Warring States period. For months, the armies moved across the landscape. Battles were fought across fields and river crossings. Fortified cities resisted, but Qin's organization and discipline slowly began to wear down the defenses of Chu. Eventually, the powerful kingdom fell. With the defeat of Chu, one of the greatest obstacles to unification had been removed. The news spread quickly across the remaining states. Messengers rode swiftly between cities carrying reports of Qin's growing dominance. In the north, the state of Yan watched these developments with concern. Yan lay near the colder northern plains. Its rulers knew that Qin's armies might soon turn their attention toward them. In a desperate attempt to stop the rising power of Qin, Yan made a bold decision. They sent an assassin. The assassin's name was Jing Ke. His mission was dangerous and extraordinary. He would travel to the Qin court pretending to bring gifts and diplomatic messages. Hidden within the gifts would be a dagger. If the assassin could strike down the king of Qin, the unification of the states might collapse. Jing Ke journeyed to the capital of Qin. He entered the palace carrying a scroll that supposedly contained maps of territory being surrendered by Yan. Within the scroll lay the concealed blade. The young king, Ying Zheng, received him in a grand audience hall. Officials stood along the sides of the chamber. Guards watched carefully.
When Jing Ke approached the throne and began presenting the scroll, he suddenly attempted to seize the king. The dagger flashed from its hiding place, but the attempt failed. The king reacted quickly and escaped the attack. Palace guards rushed forward. The assassin was captured and killed. The dramatic event revealed just how deeply the other states feared the growing power of Qin. But it also strengthened the king's resolve. The campaign against Yan soon followed. Qin armies marched north. Yan's defenses eventually collapsed. One more kingdom disappeared. Now only 2 states remained. The wealthy coastal kingdom of Qi still stood in the east. For centuries, Qi had been one of the most prosperous states in China. Its cities were filled with scholars, merchants, and artisans. But by this time, Qin's victories had already changed the political landscape. Qi found itself isolated. Its leaders realized that resisting Qin alone would be extremely difficult. When Qin's armies approached, Qi surrendered with little resistance. And with that final submission, the long era of the Warring States came to an end. For the first time in history, the lands that we now know as China were united under a single ruler. In the year 221 before Christ, the young king Ying Zheng made a decision that reflected the magnitude of his achievement. He would no longer call himself simply king. Instead, he created a new title, a title that had never been used before. He combined ancient words that referred to legendary rulers and divine authority.
From that moment forward, he would be known as Qin Shi Huang. The title meant First Emperor of Qin. It signaled the beginning of a new era. The old kingdoms had vanished. Their rulers were gone. Their lands were now provinces of a single empire. From the capital of Xiangyang, the first emperor began the enormous task of governing a unified land. The wars of the warring states had finally ended, but a new challenge had begun. How to rule a vast empire where many regions had once been independent kingdoms. How to bring order and stability to lands that had long been divided. The first emperor believed that unity required strong central authority, and so he began implementing sweeping reforms that would reshape the entire civilization. But those changes, and the great projects that would follow, were only just beginning. For the ruler who had united the states was now preparing to build something even greater, an empire that would leave a lasting mark on history. And the story of that empire continues in the next quiet chapter of our journey through time. The wars that had once shaken the land had finally come to an end. For generations, the kingdoms of Eastern Asia had struggled against one another in the long era known as the Warring States. Now those kingdoms had disappeared. Their armies had been defeated. Their kings had been replaced by governors loyal to a single ruler. That ruler was now known as Qin Shi Huang. From the capital city of Xiangyang, the first emperor looked out across a realm larger than any Chinese ruler had ever governed before. The land stretched across mountains, valleys, rivers, and plains. Cities that had once belonged to rival states were now connected under one authority. The challenge facing the emperor was immense. Winning wars was only the beginning. Now he needed to govern a unified empire. For centuries, each former kingdom had developed its own customs and systems. Weights and measures differed from region to region. Coins used in one state were sometimes unfamiliar in another. Even the written characters used by scribes could vary. These differences might seem small, but they created confusion within a unified land. The emperor and his ministers believed that unity required consistency, so they began introducing sweeping reforms designed to standardize the empire. Among the emperor's most trusted advisors remained the scholar and statesman Qin Shi. Qin Shi strongly supported centralized authority. He believed that the strength of the empire depended on clear laws and organized administration. Under his guidance, the government began establishing standardized systems across the entire realm. One of the first reforms involved the writing system. Before unification, different states had used slightly different forms of Chinese characters. This made communication between regions more difficult. Under the emperor's orders, officials created a standardized script that could be used throughout the empire. This allowed government documents, laws, and records to be understood across all provinces.
Another reform involved currency. The former kingdoms had used many different shapes and types of coins. The Qin government introduced a uniform coin that could circulate throughout the empire. Merchants now had a consistent form of money for trade. This change made commerce easier between distant regions. The emperor also standardized weights and measures. Scales used by merchants were recalibrated. Lengths used in construction were made consistent. Officials traveled throughout the provinces carrying measuring tools that established the official standards. These reforms might have seemed quiet compared to the dramatic wars that had united the land. Yet they played a crucial role in shaping the future of the empire. They created a system where distant regions could function together under one administration. Meanwhile, the emperor turned his attention to the physical infrastructure of the empire. Roads became one of his priorities. Although earlier states had built their own roads, the new empire required a network that connected every major region. Engineers began constructing wide imperial highways radiating outward from the capital. These roads allowed armies to move quickly. They allowed officials to travel between provinces. They allowed merchants to carry goods across the empire. Messengers could now ride swiftly across the land carrying orders from the emperor. Another major concern involved defense. Even though the former rival states had been conquered, the northern frontier remained vulnerable to nomadic tribes. These groups sometimes raided the borderlands. To strengthen the frontier, the emperor ordered the construction of defensive walls. Earlier states had already built segments of fortifications in different regions. The Qin government began linking and expanding these walls into a long defensive system. These fortifications would later become known as the early foundations of the Great Wall of China. Workers gathered from across the empire. Soldiers, laborers, and prisoners were sent to remote mountain regions where the walls were built. The work was difficult. The terrain was rugged, but the emperor believed these defenses were necessary to protect the northern borders. At the same time, massive construction projects continued in the capital. Xianyang grew into one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Palaces were expanded. Administrative buildings were constructed. Officials from every province traveled there to report on local affairs. The emperor rarely rested. His days were filled with meetings, reports, and decisions about the enormous empire he had created. He believed strongly that the unity he had achieved must never be lost. To maintain control, he relied heavily on the principles of legalist governance. Strict laws governed the behavior of officials and citizens alike. Rewards were given for loyalty and service. Punishments awaited those who defied the authority of the state. Some people admired the order this system created. Others feared its severity. But there was no doubt that the empire now operated with remarkable efficiency. Across the countryside, life continued beneath the watchful administration of the new government. Farmers cultivated their fields along the valleys of great rivers, such as the Yellow River. Caravans traveled along the expanding road network. Cities prospered as trade between regions increased.
The land that had once been divided among rival kingdoms was slowly learning to function as a single empire. Yet the first emperor himself was not content simply to govern. He also began thinking about something far more personal. Like many rulers in ancient times, Qin Shi Huang grew increasingly concerned about the passage of time. He had achieved extraordinary power, but even emperors could not escape the reality of mortality. As the years passed, the emperor began searching for ways to extend his life. He consulted scholars and mystics who spoke about elixirs of immortality. Some claimed that special substances might grant eternal life. Others described distant islands where immortals were said to live. These ideas fascinated the emperor. He ordered expeditions to search for such places. Alchemists and scholars were invited to the court to present their knowledge. While the empire continued functioning under strict administration, the emperor's personal interests began shifting toward the mysteries of longevity. These pursuits would eventually become an important part of the later years of his reign. But that chapter of the story still lies ahead.
For now, the first emperor continues overseeing the great projects that shaped his empire. Roads stretch across the land. Walls rise along the northern mountains. Standardized laws and systems bind distant regions together. The wars of the warring states are over. A new empire has begun. And the ruler who created it now stands at the height of his power. Yet even as his empire grows stronger, time continues moving forward quietly. The story of Qin Shi Huang is not yet finished. For in the years ahead, the emperor's ambitions will grow even greater, and the legacy he leaves behind will remain one of the most remarkable chapters in the long history of China. The empire that Qin Shi Huang had created now stretched across vast lands, from the western mountains of Qin to the eastern plains where the former state of Qi had once stood. For the first time in history, these regions were governed under a single authority. The emperor had accomplished something that generations of rulers before him had only dreamed about. Yet even as the empire functioned under its new systems of law and administration, the emperor himself continued to think about permanence. He had unified the land. He had built roads and defenses. But the question that quietly occupied his thoughts was deeper. How could his empire endure forever? And how could he himself escape the limits of human life? Throughout ancient China, stories had long circulated about immortals. Some legends spoke of sages who lived for hundreds of years. Others described mysterious islands far across the eastern seas where eternal life could supposedly be found. Scholars, alchemists, and mystics sometimes claimed they possessed secret knowledge about these matters. The emperor began inviting such figures to his court. Within the halls of the capital city of Xianyang, these visitors spoke about rare substances, magical herbs, and hidden lands. One such figure was Shu Fu.
Fu claimed that beyond the eastern seas lay sacred islands where immortals lived. According to ancient tales, these islands contained plants that could grant eternal life. The emperor listened carefully. Although he was known for his strict and practical governance, the idea of overcoming death fascinated him deeply. Eventually, he ordered Fu to organize an expedition. Ships were prepared along the eastern coast. Young men and women were gathered to accompany the journey. Supplies were loaded for a voyage into the unknown waters beyond the horizon. The fleet sailed eastward across the sea in search of the legendary islands. Ancient records later claimed that Fu never returned. Some stories suggest he settled on distant lands. Others say he continued searching for the mythical islands forever. Whether the expedition truly reached such places remains uncertain, but the emperor's interest in immortality continued growing. At the same time, Qin Shi Huang became increasingly concerned about threats to his life. He had defeated many enemies during the wars of unification. Although the kingdoms had been conquered, resentment still lingered in some regions. Assassination attempts during his earlier years had shown how dangerous political life could be. Because of these fears, the emperor began traveling frequently across the empire. These journeys allowed him to inspect provinces and observe the lands he governed. But they also served another purpose. By moving constantly between different palaces and residences, the emperor made it difficult for potential enemies to predict his location. During these travels, the imperial court moved with him. Hundreds of attendants, soldiers, officials, and servants accompanied the emperor's journeys. Carriages rolled along the newly constructed roads. Messengers rode ahead announcing the arrival of the imperial procession. Cities prepared elaborate receptions. Local officials presented reports about their provinces. Farmers and merchants gathered along the roads to watch the procession pass. For many citizens, seeing the emperor was a rare and unforgettable moment. These journeys also allowed Qin Shi Huang to observe the vast lands that now formed his empire. He visited mountains and river valleys. He inspected the northern frontier where the defensive walls were being built. He traveled to the eastern coast where the great seas stretched endlessly toward the horizon. At one point during these travels, the emperor ordered a monument carved into the side of a mountain. Such inscriptions celebrated the unification of the land and the achievements of his reign. They declared that the era of chaos had ended. The former kingdoms had disappeared, and a single empire now ruled the land. Yet while these monuments celebrated the emperor's power, another extraordinary project was quietly taking shape.
Beneath the ground near the emperor's homeland, construction had begun on a vast underground tomb. Even while searching for immortality, the emperor understood that he must prepare for the possibility of death. According to historical accounts, work on his mausoleum had begun soon after he became king. Thousands of laborers worked on the enormous burial complex for many years. The tomb was designed as an underground palace. Ancient historians described rivers of mercury flowing through the chambers to represent the rivers of China. Ceilings were decorated with images of the heavens, and surrounding the tomb, an entire army was created from clay. These figures would later become known as the Terracotta Army. Each soldier was sculpted with remarkable detail. Their armor, hairstyles, and expressions were carefully crafted. The army stood ready to guard the emperor even in the afterlife. Thousands of figures filled the underground chambers. Archers, infantry soldiers, charioteers, horses, all standing silently in rows beneath the earth. For many centuries, these figures remained hidden from the world. But their creation reflected the emperor's desire to extend his power beyond life itself. As the years continued passing, the emperor's health slowly began to decline. Despite the efforts of alchemists and mystics, no true elixir of immortality was ever found. Some of the substances recommended by court alchemists were actually dangerous. Historical accounts suggest that mercury-based compounds were sometimes consumed in attempts to prolong life. Ironically, these substances may have weakened the emperor's health rather than preserving it. Still, Qin Shi Huang continued traveling across his empire. He believed that observing his lands firsthand allowed him to maintain control and stability. One of these journeys eventually carried him toward the eastern regions of the empire. It was during this long journey, far from the capital, that the emperor's life quietly approached its final chapter. The ruler who had united the land, who had reshaped the structure of Chinese civilization, was nearing the end of his remarkable life. But the consequences of his reign would continue long after his passing. For the empire he created had changed the course of history. And even after the first emperor was gone, the idea of a unified China would remain. Yet the story of Qin Shi Huang is not quite finished. For the final days of his life and the events that followed his death would bring unexpected twists to the fate of the empire he had built. As the years passed, the long reign of Qin Shi Huang slowly moved toward its final chapter. The empire he had created stretched across mountains, plains, and river valleys. Roads connected distant provinces. Laws issued from the capital governed lands that had once belonged to rival kingdoms. The era of the warring states had ended. A unified empire now stood where many states had once competed. Yet time moves forward quietly for all rulers. Even for an emperor who had reshaped the destiny of an entire civilization. During the later years of his life, Qin Shi Huang continued traveling across his vast empire. He believed these journeys allowed him to remain close to the lands and people he governed. Wherever the imperial procession went, roads were cleared ahead of it. Soldiers guarded the route. Officials prepared reports to present when the emperor arrived. Cities decorated their gates. Local leaders waited patiently to welcome him. The emperor's travels often carried him toward the eastern regions of the empire. He seemed especially drawn to the coast, where the land met the great eastern sea. Standing on the cliffs above the waves, he sometimes gazed out toward the horizon. Ancient legends had long spoken of distant islands where immortals were said to live. Even in his later years, the emperor remained fascinated by these stories. The alchemist Xu Fu had already sailed east years earlier in search of those mysterious lands. But no confirmed report of such islands had ever returned. Still, the emperor continued thinking about the possibility of extending his life. Scholars and mystics still visited the court. Some claimed to know secret formulas that could prolong life. Others spoke of rare minerals and herbs hidden deep within remote mountains. These discussions filled the halls of the imperial residences during the emperor's travels. But while these pursuits continued, the responsibilities of ruling the empire never paused. Officials delivered reports about agriculture, taxation, and border security. The northern frontier still required careful attention. The defensive walls that would later be remembered as part of the Great Wall of China continued expanding along the mountains. Workers and soldiers labored in remote regions linking earlier fortifications into longer defensive barriers. Within the capital of Shenyang, the administrative system created by the emperor continued functioning. Governors managed provinces. Courts enforced the laws established during the unification. Standardized writing, currency, and measurements allowed the empire to operate as a single, organized state. Yet within the imperial court, concerns about the future quietly grew. The emperor had ruled for many years, but he had not clearly established a stable succession. Several princes existed within the royal family. Among them was the eldest son, Fusu. Fusu had developed a reputation for thoughtfulness and restraint. Some advisors believed he would become the next ruler. But the emperor had not formally announced his choice. As the imperial procession continued traveling through the eastern provinces, the emperor's health began to decline. Long journeys were exhausting. The remedies offered by court alchemists often involved strange substances. Some of these medicines may have contained mercury compounds that weakened the body rather than strengthening it. Gradually, the emperor became ill. The imperial court found itself far from the capital when the situation worsened. Eventually, the emperor died during the journey in the year 210 before Christ. He passed away quietly while traveling through the eastern regions of the empire. The death of the first emperor created immediate uncertainty. The empire he had built was vast. Its stability depended heavily on strong central authority. But the emperor's passing occurred far from the capital, and the question of succession had not yet been resolved. Two powerful figures near the emperor during those final days were the Chancellor Li Si and the court official Zhao Gao. These men feared that announcing the emperor's death too quickly might create chaos. They also worried about the influence of the emperor's eldest son, Fusu. After careful discussion, they made a controversial decision. Instead of recognizing Fusu as the next emperor, they altered the imperial succession. Through secret orders and forged messages, they arranged for a younger prince to become ruler. This prince was Qin Shi. When the imperial procession finally returned to the capital, the news of Qin Shi Huang's death was revealed. The young prince ascended the throne. But the new emperor lacked the authority and experience of his father.
Meanwhile, the secret manipulation of the succession created resentment within parts of the empire. Officials and generals began questioning the legitimacy of the new ruler. In distant provinces, unrest slowly began to grow. Peasant revolts appeared. Former nobles from conquered states saw opportunities to challenge Qin authority. Within only a few years, the empire that Qin Shi Huang had built began to weaken. The Qin dynasty itself would not last long after his death. Yet the story of Qin Shi Huang did not end with the fall of his dynasty. The empire he created had changed the course of Chinese history forever. Before his reign, the land had been divided among rival states for centuries. After his reign, the idea of a unified China became a permanent part of the civilization. Later dynasties would rise and fall, but they would all govern a land that Qin Shi Huang had first brought together. His reforms, standardized writing, roads, laws, and administration left lasting marks on Chinese society. Even today, the memory of the first emperor remains deeply connected to the beginning of imperial China. And beneath the earth, near his ancient homeland, the silent ranks of the terracotta army still stand guard beside his vast underground tomb. Thousands of clay soldiers, frozen in formation, waiting quietly beneath the soil for more than 2,000 years. Their presence reminds us of the extraordinary ambition of the man who first unified the land, the ruler who ended the era of the warring states, the emperor who reshaped the destiny of China. And though his life ended long ago, the story of Qin Shi Huang continues to echo through the long history of the world. Now the night grows quiet again. The rain falls softly outside. And our journey through the life of the first emperor slowly comes to rest.
After the passing of the first emperor, the great empire he had built entered a period of uncertainty. The new ruler, Qin Shi, struggled to maintain the enormous system created by his father. The laws remained strict. The administration still functioned across the provinces. But the strength of the empire had depended greatly on the authority of the first emperor himself. Without that steady presence, unrest slowly began appearing in distant regions. Some of the former noble families who had once ruled the old kingdoms saw an opportunity to challenge the Qin government. Peasant uprisings began spreading across the countryside. Armies were raised in rebellion. Within only a few years, the Qin dynasty itself collapsed. A new era of struggle followed, before another dynasty eventually restored stability. Yet something important had already changed forever. Even though the Qin dynasty did not last long, the idea of a unified China remained. Later rulers would continue governing the land as a single empire. They preserved many of the systems first established under the rule of Qin Shi Huang. Standardized writing remained. The network of imperial roads continued expanding. The administrative structure of provinces and counties endured. Even the concept of an emperor ruling over a unified land became permanent. In this way, the legacy of the first emperor extended far beyond his lifetime. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, cities expanded and transformed. But the memory of the ruler who had first united the land remained deeply embedded in Chinese history. For many generations, the tomb of the first emperor remained hidden beneath the earth near the ancient capital region. People knew the emperor had been buried with great ceremony, but few understood the scale of the monument constructed for him. Then, in the 20th century, something remarkable happened. Farmers digging a well near the ancient burial site uncovered fragments of clay figures. Archaeologists soon arrived to investigate. What they discovered astonished the world. Beneath the soil stood thousands of life-sized soldiers made from clay, each one unique, each one carefully sculpted. Rows upon rows of warriors stood in silent formation. Archers, infantry, charioteers, horses, an entire army waiting beneath the ground. This discovery became known as the Terracotta Army. The figures had been created to guard the emperor in the afterlife. More than 2,000 years after his death, they still stood watch in the underground chambers surrounding his tomb. Today, visitors from across the world travel to see these silent soldiers. They walk through the excavation halls and look down upon the rows of ancient warriors. Each statue tells a small part of the story of the empire that once rose under the first emperor. And through them, the memory of Qin Shi Huang continues to live. His life was filled with ambition, struggle, and transformation. He was born during a time when many kingdoms fought endlessly across the land. He grew up in uncertain circumstances far from home. He became king as a child. He survived palace conspiracies and political intrigue. He led the campaigns that defeated 6 rival kingdoms. And he created the first unified empire in Chinese history. The empire he built would influence the structure of Chinese civilization for more than 2,000 years. And even today, the name of the first emperor remains one of the most famous in the history of the ancient world. Now the rain continues softly outside. The night grows quiet, and our long journey through the life of the first emperor slowly comes to its end. The mountains of China remain where they have always stood. The great rivers continue flowing across the land, and somewhere beneath the soil near the ancient capital, the silent army of clay still stands guard, watching over the tomb of the emperor who first united China. Sleep well, and until our next journey through history, good night.